welcome to the Green Ring, and thanks for watching. This video is last in a series of 9 presenting a note-by-note analysis of Wagner's Das Rheingold, Scene 4. Oh wow, if you've made it this far, you are a proven Wagnerian warrior. But you'll need to be. There's a lot more stretching on from here. But hey, let's go for it. Built on nearly 2 centuries of scholarly literature, this massive journey aspires to examine in its entirety Der Ring des Nibelungen to its final note. I hope you'll take this voyage with me when I'm still working to complete. For an explanation of who I am and more on the reasons for this series, please check out my preface video. Its link is supplied below, along with those for the other videos preceding this one. We pick up where we left off in Dover's full score on the second stave of page 305, immediately after Wotan's sword inspiration. This unforgettable morpheme bundle, among the most striking in the drama, signals Wotan's inspiration to sire the Wälsung race as his means for seizing back the ring, a concept about which no commentator expresses the least doubt. Astonishingly, though perhaps not so much given the passages involve syntax, the staging tradition is as vague as the analytic is certain. Wagner's original 1876 solution has been rejected long since, and no modern production honors it. Few even attempt to connect the sword morpheme with any onstage image related to that weapon. Instead, the last decades make Wotan's spear the focus, a habit already well established by the time of Chirot's Bayreuth production for the 1976 centennial. Since then, most prominent versions emulate him. The much-lauded 1999 Met production by Otto Schenk, Copenhagen's 2003-6 mounting, the visually creative 2007-9 Führer's Bau cycle at Valencia, Kupfer's various stagings for Bayreuth and Lisieux over the years, along with the Met's 2012 revival of the Schenk production. One lone standout, Sawalisch, in 1989 for the Bavarian State Opera in Munich, actually includes a sword by the clever device of having Fafner slay Fasolt with it, so, at the right moment in the music, Wotan may draw it from the corpse. The 2013 mounting in Valhalla, Sweden, works out a compromise between this and Wagner's original idea, so perhaps the business may once again come full circle. There is no question what is meant here, but only if one knows Valkyr and beyond, a point Newman hammers home with some annoyance. Even if Wotan brandishes a sword, which he usually doesn't, audiences have famously wondered what they're meant to think, especially since, when Fricka questions the fortress's name, Wotan frames his answer obscurely. Like any good showman, Wagner means for all this to generate powerful suspense, the unanswered question luring us back for the sequel. And the truth is, for now, we do have all that we need to know. Wotan is frustrated at every turn in his attempts to make the World Ash's stolen power unequivocally his own, yet he's seen Albrecht handily wield that same force just as illegitimately got to enslave his entire Nibelung race. Nor can it be lost on the god, never mind viewers, that the dwarf's power also amasses a treasure sufficient to ransom Wotan's own stronghold. During Scene 3, the god fully expects to wield the ring, wherein that ill-gotten energy resides, so is unconcerned with the dwarf's threat of an army of night to bring down the gods. Now the ring is lost, with Albrecht and his Nibelungs at large, along with Fafner's Valhalla-crushing power, in the form of the ring, marauding free side by side with a mysterious new racial imperative. The time has come to fight fire with fire. Wotan still wields plenty of World Ash clout, thanks to Valhalla and the spear, which manipulates its purloined energy. He can't help but ponder some gambit to protect all this wealth, one similar to Albrecht's and Fafner's, which will go them one better and so defeat them. Over a stately hush-dotted minim chord on trumpet trombone's tuba, the god beckons his consort to join him by singing an inverted ash interval, whose foreboding is mitigated by its fourth descent. Yet, by continuing down a third, the phrase inverts the very melody notes which, in their wonted form, have only just given the sword its distinctive heroic contour. Tubas intone 3 static crotchet chords, then pass through an extended cadence on a series of dotted minims, as he rises on reverse chord notes on the first syllable of Valhalla, the fortress's name uttered for the first time. With it, the mode shifts to minor, only to slide back into major on the word's second syllable, a stunning mark of Erda's mysterious influence over not merely the castle, but Wotan's idea of it along with his plan to secure it. From there, he sinks on chord notes to descend an Erda fourth, finishing his thought by rising again on reverse chord notes for a last descending third, assisted by the tuba's cadence nobly resolved with Erda chords. Fricka questions the name as one she's never heard, underscored by soft brass outlining 2 Valhalla Part 1 iterations, tubas underlining the harmony on quaver pulses, each Part 1 strophe followed by octavo trumpets pulsing a single static ash interval in its Valhalla incarnation. Her simple vocal follows static notes to rise a fifth and descend on chord notes with the word namen. Her second phrase initiated after a minim rest with a sinking fourth to move through more static notes and conclude on a single up-down fourth bounce, her unconscious role as Erda's functionary. As her final fourth drops, leaving her mute until Valkyr at 2, the brass choir initiates the Valhalla Part 1 variant, meaning that segment derived from the melody notes, through association with the ring. The bundles repeats, gradually crescendo as they support Wotan's cryptic yet syntactic-rich answer, doubling added by steps of 2 repetitions each, bassoons, clarinets, then oboes with tubas. It's difficult to miss the important syntactic comment made here, given this Valhalla module has since been established as a source of arrogance, connoting vain power grabs. In that form, it lacks its wanted Valhalla ash intervals, specific to the god's powers, but here, continued from the Part 1 iterations, those trumpet strokes attend all 6 pulses. The immortal begins simply enough on static notes to leap up a fourth, only to plunge an octave, whose 2 following static notes make the figure a stately yet ominously revealing inverted ash interval on the words Fürcht mein Mut, further shoring up his illegitimate tyranny over nature's powers. The god continues with still more optimism up a third on a low interval to repeat a more leisurely static interval, then rise through another third on a second low interval, the whole with pungent irony outlining not merely a reversal of cursed lust, but also a broad abandonment triad. The phrase entire he finishes with a bold anti-barrier, capped by another plunging octave and rising fourth, these last 2 intervals adding up to yet another distorted retrograde of curse lust. Only the Meister could bundle together so cogent a bouquet of apt syntactic clues in so brief a time to efficiently deliver his message without the slightest hint of anything forced or formulaic. Over the brass crescendo, rife with trumpet Valhalla ash intervals, Wotan's first anti-barrier, octave and fourth, sound atop a last Valhalla Part 1 strophe, its arrogant rising segment's wonted harmony altered in preparation for a cadence that resembles Valhalla Part 4, but with unique differences. During the ensemble's Part 1B ascent, trombones launch a Part 1A iteration as a brief counterpoint, while its following climactic measure repeats Part 4's cadential formula, shorn of all its key elements, meaning spear, ash interval, and love, all replaced by Wotan's dire falling octave as woodwind's horns oppose reverse melody notes against melody notes proper. It's as if the god's syntax acts as a tonic to Alberich's Scene 3 intimidation. More remarkably, the juxtaposition of Part 1b in the orchestra, due of abandonment triads intact, with the Immortals vocal, produces a weirdly distorted truncation of the curse, Wotan thinking this strategy extricates him, while in truth it buries him even deeper in that malediction. Whatever else it may be, the god's plan is open war on Erda, twisting nature's power against itself in a conflict to be fought with the opposition of melody notes and their reversal, as well as Welterbe and abandonment triads, details which the epic's musical syntax continually expands and illuminates. But loss of the Fricka syntax doesn't mean that Wotan abandons love, rather he subjugates it so thoroughly it's no longer welcome in the fortress, and the love goddess is never again seen after Rheingold. Her musical syntax does continue, but only as related to pawns in the immortal strategies, whose existences are wholly in the outside world. Strings which have been absent during Fricka's question and her consort's response reappear as violas, cellos glide up Loge's chord notes, a rising version of his contempt for illegitimate power. This prefaces the god's arietta of revulsion at all this disingenuous cant. Too captivated by their Rainbow Bridge journey towards Valhalla, the gods ignore his brief aside as Loge opines, Ihrem Ende eilen sie zu. The dominant idea of this, his penultimate utterance as he weighs whether to incinerate his dubious fellows rather than join their approaching fall. Timpani grumble pairs of Valhalla ash intervals every other measure to underpin his arietta's first half, as bassoon's horns trace 3 ring fragments, the first 2 separated by a last chord note pulse. The second fragment's final note subtly devolves into Erda chords, over which cellos quiver on that module's Loge variant. The third and last fragment, now on horns clarinets, also ends with this chord evolution, cellos flickering its Loge variant as bassoon crotchets rise on 3 chromatic 6th chords, which hint at melody notes. Atop this, the arietto's initial phase, Loge's 3 echoing vocals sound over the orchestra's trio of ring fragments, pointedly separated by rests to allow the chord syntax voice. Each of these phrases recall the fire sprite's distinctive cunning, that mix of barrier and chagrin hinting at his cupidity. His initial line bounces on thirds through an inverted ash interval to twit Wotan's inspiration. His second takes its extended melody notes to connote his nature-based resistance to the god, while doubling its chagrin pulses. His third phrase complicates his barrier by bouncing on thirds, then doubling the orchestra's fragment with a Welterbe triad, moving through an inverted ash interval, Wotan's racial plan rubbing the fire sprite the wrong way, thus by inference Erda as well. Loge then recovers to finish with a third complete pulse of his slyness. This leads to his arietta's second portion. Cello's violas slide up 3 of his chromatic scales as woodwind's horns progress through a trio of Welterbe triads, albeit the third ending as a last bona fide ring fragment. Vocally, the fire god bounces over each triad with parodies of Donner's brave cry, itself a reverberation of Albrecht's failed wooing, Loge terminating each with plunging fifths. Top the fragment proper, he hops in Erda fourth on a low ash interval to intone a close relation to Donner's line, meaning a ghost of the Rhine Maiden's taunts. Violins take over for cello's violas, slithering up a last scale to initiate furious tremolos as massed woodwind's horns weave a chromatic tapestry of sinking then rising crotchets to mesh with the violin tremolos as Loge contemplates reducing the immortals to smoking ash. Doubling the orchestra's harmonic contours, his voice first sinks on a dire inverted ash interval, a flattened version of the ring, meaning with only its first Welterbe triad, then darts through static notes into an only slightly less threatening reverse ash interval. Just before the arietta's climax, he follows a pair of static ash intervals to end on the word Götter with a damning octave plunge. Atop it, violins, high woodwinds race up a last furious, non-uplet chromatic scale into a hard sting across all choirs in play during the arietta. The fire sprite has reason to fume, not simply because the gods turn out to be worse fools than even he thought. His repeated pleas for the Rhine maidens suggest he genuinely hopes Wotan might at last heed them. Yet when the Earth Mother has a chance, she doesn't order the god to obey, leaving Fafnir to slay his noble brother and carry the ring's poison away with him into their natural world. Erda seems to have cut Loge adrift by not revealing her entire plan, which now appears to endorse both the evil dwarf's racial imperative along with the gods. While dooming her giants, she also abandons the Rhine maidens in the bargain, who may be the fire sprite's daughters. Loge has taken great pains to shield all of these as they fulfill their roles to perfection in what up to now he's imagined is the Vala's only plan, her scheme to bring down the gods. Now he realizes there's a great deal more to her agenda and he hasn't been informed. The galling thought must contribute to the fire god's bitter fantasy of incinerating Wotan and his clan on the spot. This, his one impulse freely conceived in his anger, which defies even the Earth Mother. But the arietta's furious climax seems to quench his rage. Launched by a soft viola-cello pizzicato quaver, he softly muses, "Nicht dumm dünkte mich das," leaping up a tritone into an ironic anti-barrier that triggers Arco-cello's violas gliding down 2 pulses of his sinking chord note module to recall its contempt for arrogance. He continues, leaping up an air to 4th into Bedenken will ich's on a Welterbe triad, the gods' budding racial schemes both echoing and opposed to Alberich's similar aspirations, again followed by 2 string chord note pulses. He finishes Wer weiß was ich tu on a compact echo of his cunning bundle, the anti-barrier and its inversion. This swift about-face has nothing to do with any fear of Wotan. Rather, Loge hopes the Earth Mother knows what she's doing, after all, who may even have told him so in this very moment with the powers of communication only they share. In effect, he trusts she'll continue using him to frustrate Wotan's plans, along with those of Alberich and Fafnir, which is exactly what she does. In response to his thoughts, horns, low woodwinds sound 2 jovial march-like Valhalla Part 2 iterations, mingled with regular trumpet timpani strophes of the Valhalla Ash interval, the gods striding to their new home. This is the penultimate time the morpheme is heard, and specifically to highlight its spear-derived falling notes at this moment, in echo of the reverse melody notes, a key part of Wotan's racial scheme for seizing back the ring, an idea that can't help brighten the immortal's swagger as he approaches his now fully secured fortress. An abbreviated Valhalla Part 3 follows, its Erda chords frozen under the sway of the god's weapon. Its long-short-long coda, as heard in its first incarnation, meaning a low ash interval on reverse chord notes. The god's triumph does seem absolute, exactly as he pictures it in Scene 2. As the perfect capper for this bitter irony, the Rhine maidens' lament over their lost gold now drifts up from the valley below, a sweet distant barcarolle accompanied only by elegant but disjointed harp waves, pizzicato long-short-long pulses traded between low strings violas with soft timpani Valhalla ash intervals on the last beat of each measure. The nymph's iconic 3-part harmonies begin with their unforgettable version of the Erda chords, the notable difference being a gently aching minor 7th dissonance added to the first chord of each. However, this ensemble is something quite new in a number of ways. For one, it continues, not with its original syntax, but the plangent rising-falling sign introduced during Loge's panegyric. Where formerly they'd progressed into a module based in melody notes, destined to become the Nibelung tattoo, here they sing 2 retrograde strophes, making their backbones reverse melody notes, a hint Erda's made them aware of the gods' emergent racial plans with its offense to their natural imperative. Their mournful inverted echo of Wotan's grand inspiration shades his hopes, both with desolate accusation and a shadow of defiance. As added distinguishing variant, their second pulse ends on a pair of chord notes separated by a falling third, an exact duplicate of the ambivalent line welcoming Fricka back into the godly fold, marking the similarity of their wounds to those suffered by the love goddess. Adding to the irony at a slight rhythmic parallax, it's also the phrase initiating their lullaby tune, the ring's first vocal utterance. Meanwhile, Flosshilda's line acts as a sort of lagging descant to Voglund and Velgunda, who sing in close harmonies, her pair of heroic melody note inversions, a subtle hint their former leader is now disgraced by her inability to guard the Rheingold. Answering this entreaty to conscience, a soft first horn pulses the Rheingold tattoo, over which Wotan asks about all the racket, with an unnatural down-up bounce on air-to-fourths followed by melody notes, an ironic ghost of honesty, itself an echo of the tattoo atop which the last trumpet minim slides up a crotchet on poignant reverse chord notes. The maidens continue with a pair of echoing phrases, the first a chord note opposition separated by a rising fourth, the second lifting into chord notes alone, whose yearning pain emerges through that major-minor-major shift contrasting the two phrases redolent of the Earth Mothers as well as Loge's shadow, whose minor mode is created by a rising tritone taking the fourth's place in Voglunda's voice. Identifying the nymph's complaint to his immortal boss, the fire god's response bobs lightly over the Rhine maiden's continuing plaint as he sings a pair of rising arpeggios drawn from the Earth Mother's heroic notes. He sinks from the first of these on accusative reverse melody notes followed by a descending fourth into the second, finished with an echo of curse lust on a rising air-to-fourth. The penultimate verse of the nymph's lament interweaves his vocal line, while introducing several important syntactic developments. They initiate on a pair of descending modules, which Loge's vocal dotted crotchets allow further voice. Though not quite identical, the nymph's first two pulses, as led by Voglunda's soprano line, and echoed as harmonized by Flosshilda, are built on two distinct modules whose similarities play their own related, though still uniquely distinguishable roles in the tale to come, for which reason they also dominate the passages following counterpoint. Approached by a falling third, the first's operative syntax is a pulse of reverse melody notes, a module which, doubling treated as single iterations, reverberates 5 more times during the passage, an idea especially prominent in their Scene 1 frolic when they taunt Albrecht. As a side but important note, this distinctive cell also echoes Loge's first appeal for the Rhine maiden's rights in Scene 2. The second module traces the reverse melody notes in their longer 4-note version, repeated 3 times to make both ideas the passage's syntactic mainstay. It should be noted the rhythmic pulse of her extended reverse melody notes incorporates the reverse melody notes into itself, just as do the following pulses. This analysis holds both these modules are closely related to Wotan's budding racial scheme for seizing back the ring as his own. It could be argued their overwhelming presence here is problematic, but not if 2 ideas are considered. First, this lament effectively blames the god for using their gold to support his battle for world hegemony, which, as expressed in these syntactic ideas, he's decided must be achieved racially. Lastly, the nymphs hope for their treasure's return, casting a prescient shadow over Wotan's potential success, since his failure could mean their gain. Loge's final rising fourth concludes with Voglunda's top line as it ascends an octave, Flosshilda rooting it, from which the sopranos slide down those extended melody note reversals, Flosshilda underpinning their reverse melody notes with a static ash interval, just as Wotan spits out Der wünschte Nicker on a static ash interval, ended by a cruel falling octave, leaving no doubt of the ultimate bone of contention. Never mind who's on either side of it, morally speaking. This also leaves the Rhine maidens free to conclude their verse without intervening side vocals, which they do to a passage made intriguingly complex, largely thanks to Flosshilda's descant. They repeat only one pale echo of their original joy to launch a distinctive turn rising on melody notes that descends on the penultimate set of reverse melody notes, making this rising-falling sign another echo of the giant turn reversal, which plays its role in Wotan's decision to acquire the ring, then his determination to regain it once lost. The maidens conclude with extended reverse melody notes as they incorporate reverse melody notes, those cells which telegraph the god's aspirations for dominating the world's races through his own bloodline. An upward scalar viola wrench, the sting of resentment, goads the immortal's order for Loge to silence the nymphs. His vocal, a spear-like scale, ended boldly by leaping up a fourth to make it an anti-barrier. This is all Loge can stand, who lobs at the maidens the biting admonishment that, from now on, they shouldn't look for joy in their gold's glow, but that of the gods. This pleases the immortals no end, whom stage directions call upon to laugh, one direction almost universally heeded by directors. Musically, however, Loge's taunt is first and foremost aimed at the gods' doomed conceit. The Valhalla Part 1 variant supports his entire line, source of arrogance, 12 consecutive repetitions, the first 10 entirely on strings, as timpani intone their static ash intervals associated with the world ash energy held prisoner in Valhalla. The fire god's vocal first dances on 2 variants of the nymphs' former glee, filtered through their taunts, and Donner's bravado. The first shaped as heroic melody notes to remind them of their mistress, the second ended with a puckish grace up a sixth, telling them to hört, was Wotan euch wünscht. He expands this module to end it with Flosshilda's Scene 1's scold for her sister's poor care of the gold, its accusation turned against all three. Yet this module is as much a rebuke of the gods, since it promises the maidens their future vindication, which the epic's later chapters redeem. After a leisurely static ash interval, the fire god moves through a chord note opposition, then lifts a third, the whole evoking Albrecht's Scene 1 lust, which has undone them, to fall on extended melody notes, a kind of wink to their own lament, suggesting that, like them, thanks to Erda, he knows of Wotan's racial plans. After a quaver rest, he hops up a low ash interval, concatenated with its baleful inversion, both on Erda fourths, a sinister bundle looking slyly forward to the Norns' Götterdämmerung description of the spear's genesis. He ends in leisurely static interval, terminated by another descending fourth to launch the climax of his taunt, itself one of the ring's watershed moments. The passage's orchestral lines, condensed into 4 staves, more clearly highlight their interwoven syntax, another variant of the Valhalla cadence. Loge's vocal, simplicity itself, takes a descending fourth and sunny lift on a sixth, producing yet another distorted memory of cursed lust. He then pivots on thirds in a sly reversal of Wotan's inspiration, itself another cursed distortion. The fire sprite concludes with Freya's love cell, a hint he knows its promise remains unfulfilled, thanks to the immortal's irresponsibility. 4 horns take over the last 2 Valhalla Part 1 strophes from strings by altering their syntax, trading melody notes for the giant's treaty line, the flavor of betrayal and abandonment in its rising triad particularly apt here, launched and overlapped tellingly by strophes of the heroic melody notes. Pizzicato strings, meanwhile, trace opposing signs, the strongest falling rising unnaturally on violins, violas, cellos alone opposing it naturally. Along with this, timpani continue their static ash intervals, then lapse into a roll as trumpets double their interval concatenation, sparking a trill appoggiatura on first violins to announce the passage's coda, the loge morpheme in its form unique to arrogance. It's this morpheme which leaves no doubt the fire god's words are satirical, a jibe at the immortals meant to hearten the Rhine maidens, a hidden message that what the gods think immutable is hopeless, a mockery of itself that's ultimately doomed. The Meister renders this ever more pungently in that the harmony along with Loge's Freya pulse is effectively another strophe of the so-called Valhalla cadence, one lacking both its spear and world ash interval, rendering that measure an especially denatured version of Valhalla Part 4, one stressing the fire god's dog in this race, that being love. The passage's two final measures, its busily complex interplay between all orchestral voices, lacking only low brass, amplified into outlines mostly audible to a listener, reveal the loge morpheme, air chord pulses, and trumpet Valhalla ash interval strophes. Charging Loge's crowning dig with special weight, his last before he vanishes from the stage forever, at least as a singing actor, its final measure repeats the Valhalla Part 1 syntax surmounted by high woodwinds and violins in a second flippant trill appoggiatura. Wotan already dreams of the illicit sexuality with which he'll populate the world in order to win back the ring. Far from being silenced, the nymphs stubbornly finish their lament. Wandering harp arpeggios are underlined throughout by low strings trading with horns, the giants' outraged double impact, and timpani continue their Valhalla ash intervals, a pungent rhythmic mix which integrates the giant thump into Valhalla Part 1. The constant opposition of low strings with horns also creates an insidious chain of rising-falling octaves to subtly evoke Alberich's Scene 1 entrance, as well as his Scene 3 cruelty to his dwarf slaves, in turn hinting at another part of Wotan's newborn scheme to dominate mortal life, if only by inference. Ignoring the maidens per stage directions, the gods blithely cross the rainbow bridge to Valhalla, the octave's overall message, their exploitation of nature's energy, but whether towards good or ill is yet to be seen. But we can guess. The voice-leading harmony of this, the Rhine maiden's final utterance until Götterdämmerung, is meant to be striking, and it is. Their vocal begins by repeating their signature cry of Rheingold, Rheingold, now starkly alternating B minor with G-flat major triads, the major-minor-major shift evoking Erda still more powerfully, and the first time the nymph's ensemble has ever sounded the minor mode for any length of time. Voglinda's voice leading is also notable in that, rather than taking the second chord's top note as she's always done, she rocks up and down on octaves, a procedure that not only evokes the prelude's flute order, but also the low string horn pulse during this current passage with its reverberations of Alberich's evil. They continue, voice leading more usual, in another reminder of Loge's panegyric figure, this time with Voglinda's line rising then falling on fourths, to make the phrase conclude on an inversion of Erda's heroic notes, capped by chord notes. This leads them into their single longest sustained passage in minor mode, a pair of their joyful strophes, source of the Nibelung tattoo, each punctuated by Flosshilda's descant repeating the Erda inversion and concluding with Voglinda's line falling ironically on a double chord note cell, again like that when the gods welcome Freya back to their fold. These last pitches return to major mode, but a lonely horn intones the Rheingold tattoo in minor, only to have the nymphs resume in an almost caressing major, Erda's influence totally enveloping them. Voglinda and Valgunda rise from this on parallel sixth harmonies in elongated melody notes to fall in an evocation of resignation, while Flosshilda's static notes underpin them, which include two static ash intervals, then a rising octave in tandem with her two sisters ending their phrase on what are effectively Erda chords. The rising-falling turn they describe also laments Loge's seen-to advice to Wotan for stealing the ring, one only just echoed in the immortals' plans for securing his fortress, a reminder of their dashed hopes which Loge once buoyed in his panegyric. Lastly, their line is yet another echo of Erde Twilight, the circle complete. Indicting the gods as falsch und feig, the nymphs echo their bitter B minor, G-flat major triads, Vogelinde again voicing up-down-up octaves, which also starkly contrast Flosshilda's immediately prior rising one. Maidens then finish with a cutting strophe of their taunting figure, topped by a distorted barrier, its final upward leap, an Erde fourth, to leave their last note an octavo A-flat. As a symbolic whole, the passage is one continuous indictment, linking those woes unleashed by the immortals to impeach not merely Wotan's offenses to natural purity, but also Alberic's crimes, along with the gods' ill-gotten plans for countering him. Their cries are useless, of course, as low strings beat the 1-5-1 giant thump, and the six harps gradually resume their interwoven signs on semiquaver sextuplets. The arrogant last half of Valhalla Part 1 rises towards climax in 4 repetitions, the first 2 on horns, woodwinds augmenting the next pair, while high woodwinds join with violas in a trill appoggiatura, sexuality never far from this complex. It all leads to an extended climax whose familiar syntax nonetheless holds surprises. To pinpoint its wealth of syntactic detail, I've reduced what is essentially the full orchestra to 6 staves. Given this is an abbreviated version, it necessarily leaves some elements by the wayside, which in any case mostly amount to doublings of primary cells represented here. This passage may seem an excessively old-fashioned flourish, yet it serves a host of narrative purposes to cement morphemic associations with the compromised glory of the god's stronghold. Most prominent of these to an audience's ear is the sword, rising magisterially atop 4 of Valhalla Part 1's second half, meaning its melody notes, supported by regular iterations of static ash intervals, surmounted by trill appoggiature in flutes, piccolos, first violins, to confirm that, hand-in-hand with dominion over Erde's fount of natural power, sexuality, and the racial conquest it represents is the literal key to Valhalla's secured doorway. The episode's most provocative detail, its climax on Valhalla Part 4, the Valhalla cadence, strengthens this impression. It echoes that syntactic bundle cap of the sword's first appearance, whose centerpiece, a low ash interval on a rising fifth, sounds with even greater power on trombone's trumpets spread over 2 octaves, just as in Alberic's Curse on Love, and the sword's first appearance. This ultimate cadence is more prolonged, its static ash intervals doubling their density, while those trumpets which intone the sword trace an incomplete strophe of Fricka's morpheme. In such a way it throws strong emphasis on its descending fifth by making it a dire inverted ash interval. The cadence's resolution on the tonic, concluding the opera, gives a satisfying though illusory sense that the Fricka morpheme sounds whole, since the remaining trumpets complete their ash interval pulse by lifting to resolution on an Erde fourth as part of the opera's final 5-1 cadence. Taken together, this sequence produces a blaze of sonic glory, as if to suggest the fortress's portal sweeping open to welcome the gods. All that remains is the hollow coda, its rainbow bridge melody, twice shouted at top volume by low strings, brass, and woodwinds. Meanwhile, horns and the remaining woodwinds pulse on triplet quaver chords, trombones, trumpets, underpinned by timpani continuing their world ash strophes. The 6 harps crisscross on semiquaver sextuplet signs as fingered sextuplet tremolos in violins, violas double the harp rhythm. What seems pure razzle-dazzle acquires syntactic meaning through a single remarkable touch, the brass timpani ash intervals rising each time to echo that low interval in the cadence, but now on Erde fourths, as if irrevocably locking the Vala's powers into Wotan's fortress. This merciless tattoo doesn't relent until the curtain falls, a kind of massively brazen euphoria over that energy robbed from the Earth Mother as it now brilliantly throbs within the immortal citadel imprisoning it. This is proof of where that energy by right should reside, as well as an assurance that, however grandiose, Wotan's latest plan to hoard it in Valhalla hasn't a prayer of success. As a final touch, almost crushing in its power, timpani launch a thunderous roll on the work's ante-penultimate measure as lowest woodwinds brass cease on a crotchet, a tonic dotted minim spreading across all the other instruments excepting the continued glitter of harps, violins, and violas. With the penultimate measure, violins, violas break off their sextuplets on a quaver, leaving only shimmering harps, while low strings, brass thump a crotchet, the remaining orchestral voices again intoning a mighty chord surrounded only by continuing harps. With the last measure, harps cease on a crotchet, every other instrument restating the final chord extended by a fermata. If properly conducted, this formidable orchestration has the effect of a progressive final swell to all but intolerable proportions, a fittingly overbearing period to the gods' boundless hubris, one that suggests their pride must inevitably go before a titanic fall, which it most certainly does. Syntactic foundations now laid in Rheingold, the epic's next 3 chapters develop a profusion of interlinking details from it unknown to any other work of music in the Western tradition. Derek Cook's untimely death robbed the world of what would certainly have been his definitive study of that progress. The current analysis can't hope to fill the gap left by his tragic loss, but aspires to do what it can in that direction. Well, we made it. This video brings us to the end of Das Rheingold. The first installment of Valkyrie Act 1, which follows, continues to reference Dover's full score, beginning with the Act 1 prelude on page 7. While in the past I've striven to consistently mount a new video weekly, finishing Valkyrie could result in a hiatus of up to a month or more before I'm able to offer the next chapter. I beg your patient understanding. As always, thanks for watching, and please do leave your comments. Time and energy allowing, I'll do everything I can to respond. Lastly, as all YouTubers know, your subscription to this channel by itself is a huge assist in completing this vast project.